should you read documentation or should you just dive in and start building with the thing and kind of figure it out as you go? I think that this is something that I struggle with, a lot of people struggle with, and I'm going to say kind of the unpopular but probably expected thing that it kind of depends a little bit, right? If you thoroughly enjoy just reading documentation for days and days on end, be my guest. There's no issue with it. If you thoroughly enjoy diving in, building, and kind of figuring things out as you go, you can do that. Like, there's kind of not a real right answer here that's fully absolute, right? I do think a lot of people are like me, where you live in the middle ground, right? So, a lot of times, like I talked about, there's the extremes of only build, and this isn't, specifically only building, never figure out what's going on, but start with building and then ask questions as you kind of build things up. And then the other side that's only documentation, and you want to fully, uh, read into every single aspect of what's going on before you dive into building anything with it. Um, I think most people live in the middle ground. Maybe you slide, slightly this way or slightly that way. But I kind of have a very real example from this weekend, so I wanted to talk about it. I very much live in the middle, right? So I am a huge fan of reading through all of the documentations, but I get distracted easily, as I'm reading through the docs and I see something that applies to what I'm building. Uh, I feel like it's very easy to kind of jump straight in and build with that thing and, start implementing that thing into your solution. And this kind of stems from, um, a little bit of getting distracted, but also like I just feel less productive if all I'm doing is reading. And I do feel like you do the most learning when you're actually building with it anyway. But we're talking about starting points here, and so you can very much start with only reading the documentation. But I do think before jumping into any of that, unless it's just like a subject you want to learn and you'll figure things out as you go, for most technologies at least, you should have something you want to build, right? Um, so for me, right now, I've talked about it in the past couple videos. What I want to build is a game. And building this game, you run into needing a lot of things. You need to render, uh, you need to do physics, you need to understand not game, not well, kind of game programming, but also just game design in general, which has a ton of different aspects of like, under that you have being able to animate or at least plan out the animation. This doesn't fully fit into game design, but in the realm of an engineer, um, you kind of lump animation into game design because when you're working alone, you have to be able to animate to do part of game design, even if it's to some basic extent, and you kind of have someone else come in and polish it up later. Um, all of that, planning out mechanics, that's more directly tied into game design, story, all of that stuff. So there's kind of all of these topics that I need to be able to handle um, to fully build what I want to build. And so, kind of starting out, I've been like slowly reading about these things, but these two having the render just even to a basic extent, and physics, handling input stuff like that. That is kind of the base level of the game. So that's been what I focus on right now as I'm reading along other things and kind of like slowly learning those things as I'm trying to build a 2D kind of world where I can input to a character, I can, start building out maps, stuff like that. Um, Kind of grasp the core concepts. I'm trying to avoid using like a Unity or Unreal game engine. Um, there's nothing against either of those. Uh, you know, um, I think what I'm doing is a little too simple to use them. You can definitely do it in them, but in terms of like how much comes with it, it's hard to reason, building something simple. And also, my goal is to learn, right? My goal isn't to build as fast as possible. It's to take a couple years learning. So building these things from scratch, is kind of important to me. So as I've been diving into these two topics, I've been using. I have kind of. I mean, on the web, you build in theory UI frequently. I've also done some rendering in the past, so I have like some base knowledge there. And so for me, I already had some base knowledge. What I ended up going with rendering is Raylib, which is just like pretty simple to build 2D games in, and stuff. And since I already had kind of this base foundation of how to render things on the screen, this kind of, let me slide it up here, this kind of ended up being closer to this side, right? I had a kind of base level of how to render things, and so I can just kind of look at the Raylib docs, maybe read a little bit of the overview and kind of how to get like easily started, but quickly starting to build, because I already have kind of these base concepts, is a little bit easier. Physics I've never done before, right? I have kind of like very basically done this myself, building something from scratch. But I've never like fully implemented physics and gone kind of deep in it. So I ended up talking to a couple people and choosing Box 2D, but this is something where I kind of ran into this issue a little more, where I did not have an understanding of physics engines in general, besides like a very, very, very basic level. So I was kind of trying to decide where I wanted to go with this. I could sit down and read all of the docs. I could just start building with it, and this is where I kind of had the thought more so of like, I think in the middle for me is where this is better, right? And as an example of what I was doing is this weekend my goal was to read all of the Box 2D documentation. Not like every single like procedure or all of the data types or anything, but they kind of have this overview sorry, it is on the screen, that you can kind of read through and go through the foundations, go through collision, simulation, kind of the important stuff, some FAQs, and then towards the end you can kind of get into the actual like references. So I was going to, my goal wasn't to get through every single reference or anything like that, or all of the data structures, but it was to kind of get through this understanding collisions, understanding foundations and simulation and stuff. So I started reading through this weekend the documentation, until about I got to Hello Box 2D and the foundations, kind of in this area. This is where I kind of got a little bit distracted, like I talked about, and I just started converting to Box 2D. I'd kind of built out something very simple from my end, right? Very manual level, but I just kind of ripped out the inputs and stuff and was like, let me convert to Box 2D. This is the way that I'm going forward. I've kind of made that decision, so let's go ahead and convert now, right? We don't need to fully understand, when I've built out something so simple, we don't need to fully understand what's going on in the entire package to just implement it, and then you can, once you've done that, you can kind of test with things easily once you've implemented it, and so a lot of people would kind of read, the sample or start looking through the Odin side of the documentation and jump right in. But what I did want to point out is a lot of times documentation has very important things that you need to know, and it doesn't exist in the raw looking at the references or anything. I'm sure this exists elsewhere, but I think this is kind of a good example where this note right here, right? The whole idea of Box 2D is it kind of simulates the real world. So it lives best. You don't have to do this. You can do conversions, of course, but it lives best in in this MKS units, which is meters, kilograms, and seconds. So kind of how our real world looks. A lot of times you live in kind of these units or a multiple of these units, right? And right at the end of this, there is specifically a sentence: "Do not use pixel units." And this was kind of a note I had skipped over. I know I said right in this area I started building with it, but I kind of read this sentence quick and then kept going and didn't really think about fully the implications. Because I thought, I can just jump in and not use pixels until I started building with it and I realized I wasn't able to get off of these pixel values and I couldn't really understand why. And it took me a while, it took me talking to a couple people, but I ended up realizing the reason I couldn't get off these pixel units that are very easy to build in when you're just thinking of rendering, kind of hinting at what the problem is my game was built render first, right? So the first package I imported outside of base, core packages was Raylib to do this rendering because that's what I know, right? And so going back, we talk about this kind of, I knew Raylib, I started building instantly with that. I had done some basic build out of physics myself, and so I had started out building that basic physics around Raylib. And so I had to talk to some people to kind of figure out how to make this full conversion, where this piece is like dove into much more deeper later in the Box 2D documentation. And so because I got distracted, I did not understand kind of what the implications were and how to go get around them, right? And so this is kind of an argument for moving towards your docs. However, on the other side, in terms of only build, I ran into another issue while I was doing this. And this was, I realized this after I had made all of the changes I talked about with people, to kind of move to the meters instead of pixel units, because I was only focused on movement at this point. So even though it's MKS, I was focused specifically on meters at this point over pixels. However, I ran into this issue where I have like this player who I set to an initial position of 1, I think it was -1. So basically this just sets the position to 1 meter in from the left and then 1 unit down from the top, right? So it's 1 meter left and then 1 meter down, so it's not like right in the corner, it's just like slightly in. And so I would place him there, and I had gravity, turned on, and the idea of him was, there's a player placed up here. This is kind of typically like the base example. If there's like ground down here, and I want it to fall down, with gravity, you see the collision with the ground. Kind of that's the idea I was going for, to just kind of get an idea of what was going on. And so in Box 2D, you have this idea of world stepping, right? And this is done to basically tell Box 2D to simulate physics, right? Go ahead and advance. Right, so this is advance the world. So in this case, because we were in such a basic level of what was going on, the entire advancement of the world was apply gravity and check collisions, right? The idea being that this player will fall until it collides with the ground, where it will just sit on top and it will no longer fall any further. Typical real world example, kind of typical base case. However, when I would do the first world step, right, so we would have this player and his position was 1, -1, said, and then I would world step, and then the player would go to, the player's position would instantly become not a number. and this is something that plagued me for hours, right? So I would run into, I would look up documentation, I would ask people, and people kind of couldn't figure out what was going on until a more expert game programmer replied to me and said, oh, now I'm forgetting what the title is, but it's something like step count, right? It's not count, but basically in Box 2D, you set this number. We've zoomed in too much for this to be super focused, so I'll try to write less. But you set this step count that is the time between steps. So typically, or at least from a base case, you set this as the frame rate. So every frame, I want to step the world, right? And this was something that, I hadn't fully wrapped my head around, and so many people obviously didn't think about. But if there's an issue here at all, it sets these positions to not an upper. And this is something that's not really documented anywhere. It's something that like only a few people know. This is something that would have plagued me for a long time, or the same amount of time when I had finished the documentation, when I'm eager to keep, building and learning. Because this took about a day to figure out and resolve. And during that day, I was able to keep reading documentation, learn about collisions, and get a deeper understanding of that. So yeah, this is a perfect use case of leaning towards building over reading. And so that's something I kind of realized that it was a good thing that I got distracted and started building with so that I could figure this out now. But this is why I say, I think most people live in the middle ground like me, where you do get good use cases out of both sides. And for a lot of people, it's very hard to sit down and just read documentation for a day and a half straight. Especially if you're learning a new language like that or something and you're reading the whole reference. It just takes so long. So don't feel bad if you live somewhere in the middle. There are definitely good things to see on both sides, but like I said, this isn't absolute, and it very much depends on kind of where your knowledge is and the pieces you're lacking, right? So for me, a render library, using it to a basic extent, like I said, my knowledge lacking is more with Raylib as a technology than rendering in general, and so being able to just sit down and build with Raylib, I'll kind of see the typical errors that you will with UI and be able to solve those myself, versus like Box 2D, it's a brand new concept to me. So sitting down and reading the documentation and understanding all of these kind of easy pitfalls of physics engines was very important. So if you guys have any thoughts, leave them down in the comments. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It very much helps me out, and the like button as well. Also, if you have any other concepts you want me to go over or recommended reading or learning, let me know, and I'll take a look. Thanks.